Before we begin, this story contains descriptions of a mass casualty disaster, deaths, and the systematic targeting of an immigrant community by corporate lawyers. If any of that's something you need to step away from, we understand. This episode's narration is AI-generated. The research, writing, and editorial decisions behind every story are made with care for accuracy and respect for those involved. January 15, 1919. Commercial Street, Boston's North End. A man named Isaac Gonzalez was eating lunch near a freight shed when the ground shook. He heard what sounded like rifle shots, 6 or 7, rapid and getting louder. Then the shed wall in front of him came apart. What replaced it was molasses. Between 15 and 25 feet high, accounts vary on the exact figure, moving at an estimated 35 miles per hour, faster than any person alive could run. By the time the wave stopped, 21 people were dead. Boston Harbor ran brown for months, and the company that owned the tank was already working on its explanation. You're listening to the Unlit Room. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Today, a 50-foot tank of molasses, a company that needed someone to blame, and 21 deaths that changed American construction law forever. Boston's North End in 1915 was the most densely packed neighborhood in the city. Brick tenements pressed against warehouses. Warehouses pressed against rail yards. Everything in the neighborhood ran low to the ground, except for one structure rising 50 feet above Commercial Street at the foot of Copp's Hill. A steel tank, 90 feet across, tall as a 5-story building, built by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company to hold the raw material for munitions-grade alcohol, molasses. The man who authorized its construction was Arthur Gell. His title was company treasurer. He was an accountant. Not a single licensed engineer reviewed the blueprints before the tank was built. The tank was filled for the first time in 1915. Within weeks, it was leaking. Not a hairline seep from a single weld, a visible, ongoing release from multiple points along the base. A permanent puddle of hardened molasses stained the cobblestones directly below. Neighborhood children scraped at it with sticks. Workers described the tank as singing in cold weather, a low metallic groan as the steel contracted in the freezing temperatures. The tank stood at the foot of Copp's Hill, painted a dark brown, the color of dried molasses. From the street, it looked unremarkable, solid, maintained. The North End residents knew better. They'd been collecting free molasses off Commercial Street for years, scraping it up and taking it home for cooking. Some workers estimated the leaking had started within a week of first fill. USIA was aware. The question was always what to do about it. They didn't bring in an engineer. They didn't file a report. What Arthur Gell actually decided, the specific action he took when the leaks were reported, is a detail the company kept out of the record for years. We'll come back to it. In the meantime, the tank kept filling. The tank kept leaking, and on January 13, 1919, 2 days before the flood, USIA filled it to near capacity. 2.3 million gallons, freshly arrived from a ship in the harbor. The temperature that night was below freezing. By morning, it had risen nearly 40 degrees. Inside the tank, the molasses was fermenting. Carbon dioxide was building up inside the sealed vessel. The same welds that had been letting molasses out for 4 years were now holding back a column of liquid weighing, at maximum fill, roughly 26 million pounds. Commercial Street on a January noon looked like it always did. Freight carts moving, workers eating outside in the unexpected warmth, the harbor smell mixing with coal smoke from the rail yards, the kind of ordinary Wednesday that doesn't distinguish itself until it does. Micro Cliffhanger 1. The tank had been failing quietly for 4 years. On January 15, 1919, it failed all at once. Nobody on Commercial Street had more than a few seconds to understand what was coming. Workers in the freight yard heard the rivets go first, a rapid sequence, like gunfire getting louder and faster as the internal pressure found each weak point in the steel in turn. After the rivets came a sound that witnesses couldn't agree on, a roar, a grinding, a rush of air. Then the tank's walls folded outward. The wave was between 15 and 25 feet high. It moved at an estimated 35 miles per hour, faster than the human sprint record at the time. There was no outrunning it. Everything the wave picked up became a weapon. Freight carts, lumber, sections of iron railing. The mass of the fluid behind them drove ordinary objects through walls. The MBTA elevated structure on Atlantic Avenue, steel support pillars, bent and buckled under the wave's force. Sections of the elevated track sagged toward the street below. The firehouse at 673 Commercial Street was struck and swept partially from its foundation. The brick exterior held, but the interior collapsed. A North End resident named Martin Clofferty was killed in the collapse. His mother Bridget was injured in the same event. The USIA workers who'd been eating lunch in a shed adjacent to the tank were engulfed within seconds of the first rivet blowing. Truck drivers in the freight terminal had no warning. Their horses, panicking in the rising surge, couldn't free themselves from their harnesses. Isaac Gonzalez survived. He clawed through the current as it thickened around him. The molasses cooling as it spread outward, changing from a fast-moving liquid to something closer to setting cement the farther it traveled from the tank. First responders who arrived at the scene found something no emergency protocol covered. The flood was chest-deep in places. Falling meant being unable to stand back up. The viscosity trapped anything that went below the surface. Rescuers held each other's belts and moved in pairs so no one went under alone. A nurse treating the injured described trying to hold a victim's hand through the cooling molasses as gripping someone through a thick rubber glove that was slowly hardening. The horses that couldn't be freed were shot. The final count, 21 dead, approximately 150 injured. Boston Harbor ran brown from the runoff through spring. The sweet smell hung over the North End for weeks. Some survivors said it made them ill for the rest of their lives. Newspaper columnists noted, with dark humor, that all of Boston smelled like gingerbread. Firefighters used saltwater hoses to cut through the hardening crust. The spray turned everything amber. Rescue workers tracked molasses onto the transit cars, into the shops, across the city. The cleanup ran for days. What couldn't be cleaned up as quickly was the question everyone was now asking. Whose fault was this? Micro cliffhanger 2. The City of Boston and private plaintiffs filed civil suit against USIA in April 1920. The company had to respond, and they had already chosen who to blame. Who they pointed at says as much about this disaster as the tank itself. USIA's legal response was ready before the rescue operation had finished. Their lawyers presented an explanation, and it had nothing to do with steel quality or engineering shortcuts. The theory USIA's defense team argued was sabotage. Galleanist anarchists, they claimed, had planted a bomb. The Galleanists were a real organization, followers of Luigi Galleani, an Italian anarchist whose network had carried out bombings in Boston and across the northeastern United States in the years immediately before 1919. The North End had a large Italian immigrant population. The accusation was designed to feel credible to anyone already frightened by radical violence. There was no physical evidence, no blast crater, no detonator components. The structural failure pattern was consistent with an internal pressure collapse, not an external device. Investigators found nothing. USIA argued the anarchist theory anyway. The plaintiff's engineers advanced two different explanations. The first, thermal expansion combined with fermentation overpressure. The tank had been filled to near capacity 2 days before the failure. Overnight temperatures rose nearly 40 degrees. Carbon dioxide from fermenting molasses added internal pressure to an already stressed structure. The combination pushed the weakest welds past their limits. The second, that the steel and rivet quality was so far below standard that failure was likely eventually regardless of the temperature event. The thermal swing may have been the trigger, but the cause was in the blueprints from the beginning. Both plaintiff theories could be true at the same time. Both pointed in the same direction, toward USIA's construction decisions. USIA spent 3 years in court, pointing somewhere else entirely. The civil proceedings lasted more than 4 years. Hundreds of witnesses, engineering experts, survivors. USIA's lead defense attorney prosecuted the anarchist theory in open court with no physical evidence. The Italian immigrant community in the North End, the people who had been living under that tank, collecting its leaked molasses off their street for years, spent 3 years of civil proceedings under formal accusation. No detonator, no testimony connecting anyone in the neighborhood to a bomb, 3 years of accusations. Meanwhile, the plaintiff's engineers had obtained the original blueprints. What they found was a structure that no licensed professional engineer had ever certified. Rivet spacing was non-standard. Steel gauge was below what was required for a vessel of that volume. The structural deficiencies were visible at the design stage. No one with the credentials to identify them had reviewed the plans before construction began. That brought the proceedings to Arthur Gell. Gell's expertise was financial records, not structural engineering. He'd been given authority over the tank because it was, from the company's perspective, a capital expenditure, a budget item. Massachusetts had no law requiring a licensed engineer's review. No one above Gell had required it. He reviewed the blueprints, approved the expenditure, and signed the paperwork. He didn't know what he was looking at, and nobody made him find out. In August 1925, court-appointed auditor Hugh O. G. Den issued his ruling. He rejected the anarchist theory. The evidence didn't support it. He found USIA negligent from the design stage, through every fill, every known leak, every decision not to bring in a qualified engineer. USIA was ordered to pay $628,000 in damages. No criminal charges were ever filed against any corporate officer. But the trial record surfaced one more detail about what Arthur Gell had actually done when the leak started. Workers had reported the seepage early. The molasses pooling on the cobblestones was impossible to ignore. It hardened, stained, stayed there. The tank was audibly stressed in cold weather. The evidence of the problem was visible to anyone on Commercial Street. When that evidence was reported to Arthur Gell, he didn't call an engineer. He didn't file a report with his superiors. He didn't document the problem at all. He ordered the tank painted. Molasses brown, the exact color of what was leaking out of it. So the seepage stains wouldn't show from the street. So the rust marks wouldn't register against the steel. So the company's storage tank on Commercial Street would look, from the outside, exactly like a structure that was holding together. He never filed a report. He never told his superiors. He kept that decision entirely to himself. USIA's lawyers spent 3 years in court blaming the Italian community of the North End for those 21 deaths. That was the second time the company tried to make something invisible. Arthur Gell's paint order was the first. Both decisions had the same goal: ensure that nobody in authority ever looked too closely at what was actually happening. Massachusetts passed the country's first professional engineering certification requirement in the aftermath of the flood. The law mandated that licensed engineers sign off on construction projects, that someone with actual credentials and actual professional liability had to review the plans before the first rivet went in. That standard spread. It's in force across the country today. Every bridge, every building, every structure stamped by a licensed engineer carries that requirement in its regulatory history, and the memory of those 21 deaths in it. Arthur Gell didn't set out to kill anyone. He painted a leaking tank because the alternative was expensive and would have required him to explain something he'd rather not explain. The distance between that decision and 21 bodies in the street turned out to be 4 years, and the company blamed the immigrants. The strategy failed in court, eventually, but it cost the North End community 3 years of formal accusation pointed at by the same company whose tank had just killed their neighbors. The instinct to name a scapegoat before the investigation concludes is not something we invented recently. If this one kept you up tonight, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend who can't sleep. Full story on the main channel. Follow if you're wide awake. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.